Welcome back. We're in San Francisco with Sony Kapoor. We're talking about finance capital and the crisis and what we should do. Thanks for joining us. So the power, even more concentrated than before the crisis, seems to be with Goldman Sachs. If there's been a winner out of all of this, Goldman Sachs seems to be the clear victor of the crisis. It's hard to go anywhere where Goldman Sachs doesn't have a hand. I was in Toronto recently and I met with one friend at a film production company. Turned out it was financed by Goldman Sachs. I met with another friend who just left a television network, and it turned out that the big buy that had just happened of a takeover was financed by Goldman Sachs. This is all in Canada. I mean, the tentacles of Goldman Sachs go everywhere. And we know President Obama got significant support from Wall Street during his election campaign. And there's certainly a perception amongst many that Geithner is a man who didn't work directly for Goldman Sachs, but was a regulator who was a product of the culture of that. What is the reality, the power of Goldman Sachs, both in terms of finance and politics?
Goldman is, as you said, an outlier, but it's a bigger problem than that. It is the whole financial community, the big banks, the big boys. It's particularly tricky in places such as the United States, where there is a revolving door between the industry and the government and the regulators and the bureaucracy. And what outsiders find particularly strange is how some individual working for a bank could the next day be working for the regulator, or the regulator could be working for the bank, and they could then suddenly get elected to the Senate or get into the White House. It's a strange game. And while there is no suggestion of impropriety, but it does create serious questions of conflicts of interest. And and it's not just about monetary conflicts of interest, etc. It's also about the mindset. It's not very clear who these people are and what they're thinking. And there might be honest, good, well-meaning people, and which most of them probably are. So that's a very serious problem. Goldman, in particular, benefited from this crisis because it was seen to have a better risk management system than other banks, partly because it, until recently, used to have a partnership culture where everybody had a lot to lose, and so partners kept an eye out on what everybody else was doing because they had an incentive to. And when it changed to a public company, some of the culture stayed. So that's one part of the outreach. The second is, yes, it is true Goldman did better than the other banks out of the crisis, but it wouldn't exist were it not for the bailouts. On the one hand, Goldman was, I think, on record saying, hey, we didn't benefit much from the bailout. But for example, if AIG had been allowed to go under, Goldman's exposure to AIG was massive. It would have lost an enormous amount of money. It hadn't received the $10 billion or something of potential funding. The lack of confidence in the market was such that no matter how strong an institution you were, you would have been pulled under. Lehman could have easily survived if there was a little bit more confidence in the system. It wasn't insolvent until the very end. It became insolvent because nobody was ready to do business with it. So the perception was very important. The other part about Goldman is, in a way, it's the only one line of evidence we've had. We're sitting here now, and Goldman did better, but it could have been Morgan Stanley. It was a particular decision at one point to get out of the subprime market earlier than everybody else. But it could have been Lehman, it could have been anybody else. It happened to be Goldman, but it could have been somebody else.
One of the things there's been a lot of conversation about is the role of the Fed. President Obama is proposing that the Fed should actually be the more overseer of this new banking system. You have people like Ron Paul and Kucinich and others who have talked about the complete lack of transparency at the Fed. You can go a little further. Some people talk about the Fed simply printing money, and it's going to give rise to some tremendous debasement of the currency. What's your take on the Fed?
I think it's a very venerable institution, and it has a great history. But you do have a structural problem, unlike in other countries where the central bank either clearly was a wing of the government and it was made independent, but is still clearly part of the government. there's a proper accountability mechanism. There is independence of central bank, but there are proper accountability mechanisms in place, because these are public institutions, these are proper parts of government. But the Fed has, partly because of the burden of history, this private structure, and it's not very obvious to most people how compatible this particular governance structure and lack of transparency and lack of accountability mechanisms are with much greater power that perhaps is needed, was exercised, and might be a good idea to put into the rule books in case there's a future crisis.
Well, is part of a real reform of the finance system a real reform of the Fed? I mean, should the Fed be turned into a proper central bank like there is in most industrialized countries?
It's kind of bizarre to outsiders why that hasn't already been done yet. So I think it's long overdue, and absolutely yes.
And what about there's a libertarian economic idea about get rid of the Fed, and if you go back constitutionally, I think they're correct. It's supposed to be Congress that mints the money, not a semi-private organization. So the institution of a real central bank is a necessity, as you say. But what about this whole issue of what they talk about, the fiat money supply, and what that does, and the issue of whether there should be a return either to a gold standard, or are these corrective measures that are meaningful?
It's too big a debate to go into a very short time, but very quickly, the contribution of fiat money recent years to the money supply, etc., has been shrinking. Most of the credit creation now comes from the private sector. The government plays a very, very small role, and at least until the point the crisis hit, where those old capacities to print money have been used to put credit in the system, and those powers were used to help reduce the severity of the crisis, it has played a less and less role. So it's not very clear how important or significant that debate is as to whether the Fed or the Congress should have the power to print money, because hardly anybody's been doing much of it until recently. The second thing, in terms of going back to the gold standard had its own very serious problems, and it's not an obvious solution. One of the interesting ideas being floated around is an international basket of currencies, which would mean that the responsibility of being the international currency, reserve currency, would get off the shoulder of the United States, which would have pluses and minuses. The pluses would be that you would have, you would not be automatically forced to run a deficit if everybody else wants dollars, which is what you've been forced to do. But the disadvantage would be that you wouldn't be able to get away with being spendthrift anymore, because you would have to live like all other countries have been forced to for a long time. And it would also be a system that's more stable in the long run. So the idea is, for example, to use the IMF's special drawing rights, which is a basket of big international currencies, the euro, the yen, the British pound, the Swiss franc, the US dollar, etc., with the weights of these economies as the de facto international reserve currency. I think that's the right direction in which to move in, and the United States should encourage that.
Okay, we're going to go one more segment, and I'm going to ask you what's next in terms of the world economy. We're told we're bottoming out, we're in place for recovery. How real is that? Please join us for a prophetic next section on The Real News.